Hey everybody, this is Alex Merced, and you're listening to me. But this is going to be my Mongoose masterclass. So this isn't like a masterclass of everything to do with the Mongo database, but it should give you a really solid foundation of how to use the Mongo database with Node using the Mongoose ODM object document mapper, the library that lets you basically connect and use Mongo in the Node world. Okay, so that's essentially what we are doing here. Okay, so let's do this. So you can see there's like a lot of helper libraries, but honestly, like if you know how to use the Mongoose library, you don't oftentimes need all these like fancy like connector libraries. You can just use Mongoose, and it just works. See the Mongoose MongoDB ODM object document mapper. Now, what does that mean? Object document mapper. Let's just take out the D and just think about object mapper, because when it comes to SQL databases, you have object relationship mappers. And this is a object document mapper just because there are two different types of databases, document versus relational database. But the concept is the same. The idea is that when you're working with a database, you have different like collections of data. So I might have a collection of data on dogs. I might have a collection of data on cats. I might have a collection of data on people adopting those dogs and cats. So each sort of type of thing that you're tracking is referred to as a model. It's a data type, a model, a data model. Okay, so what's going to happen is that generally what you do with any of these object mappers, okay, whether they're an ORM with an SQL database or an ODM with a document database like Mongo, is you define your data models as sort of objects in that language. So usually like a class. In JavaScript, we're actually just going to use straight up objects. But you're defining sort of like, what does this data model look like? What are like the different fields, the different types of data in, like, how do you define a dog? And then basically what it does is that it creates an object from that definition, that data definition, that has a bunch of functions or methods built in that's going to allow us to work with that data. So whenever we use that dog model to add, delete data, it's going to do it to a dog collection in the Mongo database. If we have a cat model and we use that that object and its methods, it's going to interact with like the cat table or collection in the database. So that's essentially what it is. It's a lot easier per se. It makes working with your database feel more like you're working in your language versus writing a bunch of SQL queries or Mongo queries, etc. Okay, it allows you to just kind of interact with your database in a more sort of object-oriented way, where you're treating your collection of data as this object that has ways of doing things. So that's what we mean by an object mapper. It's mapping your data to an object. Okay, now let's see here. Let's go to VS Code. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a Node project. We're not going to create a backend server with like Express, Fastify, or Koa. Like, you can technically take what we're going to do here and you can apply it to any of those, because at the end of the day, all that matters is that you create your objects. You create those, like the cat object, the dog object, and then you can use those in your routes and any backend framework to work with your database. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new Node project, new npm init-y. Okay, and keep in mind I do have a Mongo server running locally. Okay, so if for you to be able to like do this exactly the way I do it, you should download and install Mongo and have a locally running Mongo server. Okay, if you don't want to do that, then what you can do is you can go to mongodb.com and you can get a free database from mongodb.com, and then you can get your URL for mongodb.com. Just keep in mind you're going to want to do three things once you log in. When you first log in, you're going to create your cluster, which is just essentially this giant database of databases. You get one free cluster, but that's really all you need for practice. I mean, you'll never need another free cluster just for like hobby projects. One is plenty. I have multiple webcams, so I keep looking into the wrong webcam. Getting used to this whole new format where you can actually see me as I talk. But yeah, so basically you're going to want to create your cluster. Once the cluster is created, you're gonna see like there's all these menu. This is menu off to the left. Okay, so like let me log in real quick, just so you can kind of see how this is all set up. Then I have a few Mongo accounts because every time I teach a new class, although that's not what it's asking me to do. There we go. Okay. Every time I teach a new class, I have to, show them how to create and set up a Mongo account. So I do this all over again. Okay. But we're not going to go through this step by step. I have quite a few videos where I go through this step by step already. But essentially, when you create your cluster, you're going to end up with something like this. I see they have updated the UI a little bit. This looks a lot nicer than it used to look. Okay. But essentially, there's a couple things you do need to do. Okay. You're going to go to database access and create a user. Make sure you remember that username and password you create for your database user. Okay. Send the email, verify that a little bit later. And then you need to go to network access, and you need to make sure that you have like this 0.0.0 on. It just means like all IPs can make requests to your database. Unless you have a static IP address on your computer that you want to make set up. But you have to do those two things. You need to have a user for your database, and you need to make sure that the IP addresses are approved, so that way you can make a request to the database. And then after that, you go here to databases. Here's your database cluster. You can click connect. Okay, right now this cluster is turned off because I haven't used it in a while. So we'll turn it back on. It'll take a few minutes. But the idea is that you'll click connect, and then you'll go to connect your application, and you'll get this URL with the information from your database. Just put in your user name and your password in the URL, and then that's the URL you would need to do what we'll be doing in this exercise. So you don't actually have to install Mongo on your computer if you do not want to, but otherwise get a MongoDB account, set up your MongoDB cluster, and that's it. Okay, and again, notice I'm using it for Node.js. So they'll ask you what your driver is, but it really doesn't matter. Whatever driver you're using, it's always going to be the same URL. Yeah. Okay. So this is cool because this is like a free service, so you can play with Mongo. It's pretty awesome. There's a lot of other really cool features that it has, but we're not going to get into that because that's like a whole thing in itself. But this will give you a database to be able to like work with for this exercise if you don't want to install MongoDB on your own computer. Okay, I have MongoDB on my own computer, so I can do something like this. I can be like type in Mongo, and it takes me into the Mongo shell. Okay, and I can type in commands. Although I'm going to exit. It's been a while, so I don't see if I remember how to exit. Yep, there we go. Okay. So now that we've done that, I have my package.json because I did that npm init-y earlier to create a new project. And all I really need to install is npm install Mongoose. That's all I really care about, because we're just learning how to connect to Mongo Node. Okay, it doesn't matter where I do it. What matters is that I have the objects available when I need them. So I'm going to just create a like db.js. Okay, now essentially what you would do is we would bring in Mongoose. So let's say const mongoose equals require Mongoose. Okay, and again, this is how you import things in Node. So if you're not that familiar with Node, this is how you import things. I hit require and I say, hey, where's that thing that I installed? So if I go back to my package.json, I did that npm install Mongoose, and now Mongoose is here, my dependencies. And now I can bring it in and save it in this variable so I can use it. Now, once Mongoose is imported in a file, okay, the next thing I need to do is just kind of set up a few things. Okay, I want to connect. Actually, we'll just connect to the database. We'll keep it straightforward. Connect to the database. Okay, and then here you'll do mongoose.connect. Okay, what this function does is it connects to your Mongo database. So the first thing you're going to pass in is the URL you're connecting to. So that could be that URL from mongodb.com. It could be your local running on your computer Mongo database. Keep in mind that if you deploy an application, you can't use your local Mongo database because I'm assuming you don't have a static IP address. You would need to use like Mongo, the MongoDB.com service to do so. Okay, so that's the deal. So in this case, I'm going to use my own local server because I've done it plenty of times. I know the URL off the top of my head. And generally, if you install a MongoDB server on your computer, it's always going to be generally installed in the same place unless you have something conflicting with it. So basically, the way URLs typically work, okay, is the very first thing that any database URL has is the type of database it is. So basically, it's like the little thing that says, okay, this is the type of database I'm connecting to. Then it's the username and password if there needs to be one. Okay, like for my local database, I don't need a username and password because it's my local database. So then it would be the host. But so localhost is my computer. And the Mongo database by default will always try to run on port 27017. Okay, I've just memorized that because it's always the same thing, and I've been doing this for several years now. Time flies by. Okay, 27017. So essentially, I'm saying, hey, connect to a MongoDB database. The server is located here. Now, once you connect to that Mongo database, I want you to specifically work with a specific database in that cluster. And then the next part is the name of the database. The great thing about Mongo, unlike SQL databases, is you don't have to pre-create things. Okay, so you don't have to create the database ahead of time. You don't have to create the collections ahead of time. If it doesn't exist, Mongo will just create it. So I can just sit there and say, hey, my practice DB. Okay. Do I have a database called my practice DB? I don't know. But if I don't, Mongo will create it. This is different than working with SQL databases where like if the database doesn't exist, it's going to throw an error saying, hey, this database doesn't exist. Okay. One of the really cool things about working with Mongo that you can just write your code and it'll just generate the things you need. Okay. Now on top of that, if I do this, okay, I technically I can just run this code now, and I'll already see, basically, and then again I want to disconnect after I'm done, just to, because I don't want to keep an open connection. So we'll say mongo.disconnect. Okay, and there's no need to do anything there. Okay, so basically what I'm doing here. Now, if you're like using Express or Fastify, you generally don't need to do like a Mongoose.disconnect because your server is going to stay connected to Mongo while it's running. So in that case, you don't really need to do that. But for like if you're running like a script where you just want to do a few things to your database and stop, then you want to make sure you connect and disconnect. Okay, so disconnect to the database. Well, let's see what happens when I run this script. So that'd be like node db.js. Okay, notice I get all these like little warnings. Okay, all these like little like warnings. Technically, they shouldn't cause you any trouble, but if you want them to go away, what you do is that there's a second argument you pass to connect. It's an object. It's a configuration object, and there's a particular properties. The warnings will tell you what they are that you need to add. So particularly, they are use new URL parser. I'm going to set that to true. And use unified topology. We want to set that to true. Okay, so now that I've set those there, if I use this, I should get no more deprecation warnings. Let's see. Yep, no more deprecation warnings, but there's no output otherwise. So how do I know that I actually successfully connected and disconnected? Okay, what you can do is that once the Mongo has connected, there is something inside of Mongoose called the connection object. Okay, the connection object. Okay, what a lot of people will do is they'll create a variable called db for database, and they'll say that equals mongoose.connection. Okay, you don't have to. You can just do mongoose.connection dot whatever. Okay, this is just so that we don't have to type as much. So now what you can do is you can actually create events based on things that happen, like Mongoose getting connected, Mongoose getting disconnected. And the way that would work, it would be db.on. It could also have been mongoose.connection.on. Okay, but again, that's the reason why we signed it to a variable, so that we don't have to type as much. And there's a couple different events. There's a bunch of different events if you read the documentation, but the ones we're going to talk about now is when the connection opens. So that means a connection was opened. And then what it's going to do, it's going to run a function. Okay. And I could just write a several like db.ons. I could just write these. I could also chain them together and be like dot on, dot on, dot on. I will keep them separate, so that was just a little bit clearer to read today. But then I can be like db.on the connection close. So when the connection closes, it runs a function. Okay. And you can do whatever you want in that function. So again, you can have, if you wanted to make sure that like the connection's open, because let's say you have code that for some reason the connection doesn't open yet because it sometimes maybe there's just lag and it may take a few seconds. So your code runs and it errors out because it tries to run before the connections have been established. Wrapping them in a db.open on open will help because it'll wait. That code will wait till the connection opens up. So these can be used for other things than what I'm about to use them for right now. And then there's db.on error. Okay, so there's an error event. And then this also takes a function, except this function also receives the error itself. Okay. So we have these three functions. Typically what I like to do is have a console.log when the connection opens. So Mongo connected to MongoDB. And then console.log connected or disconnected. And then if there's an error, console.log, there is an error. Okay, and then we console log the error. Okay. And this way, if any of these situations happen, I get some output. Okay. So the way I look at my terminal, I can get some details. So let's try running the code now. And see, I can see that it got connected. So the connection was open because it connected to this URL. And I didn't get any deprecation warnings because I have this object. And then I got disconnected. Wonderful. Okay. Now, how do we actually like add and subtract stuff? Well, you could send like one-off queries using the connection objects. You can there's a way of okay, let's see here. If I do db, let's see if I do db dot, I think there's a whole bunch of things you can do here. Like, say you can actually drop collections, drop database. Can you do just like a particular model once? Probably like transaction or something where you can just do like a one-time pass in an actual direct Mongo query. Like Mongo has its own kind of language. It's very JavaScript-esque. But there's no need to do that. What we want to do is create our own, let's say, cat model. Okay, so we're going to create a cat model. And it requires two steps. Step one is create a schema. Step two, we're going to create the model. Okay. Now the schema is the definition. The schema is like the blueprint for the data that we're working with. So const, we'll say cat schema, the definition of a cat, and then we create this object. But basically, we have to we have to create a special type of object. So we're going to say new mongoose dot schema. Okay, and then we pass an object to the schema constructor. Okay, and then here we just define the properties. So we're going to say every cat has a name, which is a string, and an age, which is a number, and that's it. Like I could do something, make this fancier. So let's say I want to add more details. I can configure this even deeper. I could pass an object and then be like, the type is a string, but it has to be unique. Okay, unique. I could also say, is it required? And I could say true. So then every cat has to have a name and it has to be unique among all the other cats. So there's a bunch of these kind of like configurations and little like ways of specifying in your schema of how things should work. There's validations you can do. There's a lot you can do inside the way you define your schema. So you could spend a while just learning all the bits about how to define your schema in Mongo. But that's essentially it. Once I do this, what I've done is I've created the definition of what a cat is. But this doesn't let me actually like add and subtract cats. What I need to do is create the model. So now that I have the schema, what I'll do is we'll create the cat model. Usually what you do is you name the variable uppercase singular. Okay, and it equals new, actually not even new, we do mongoose dot model. Okay, and this is a function that's going to take in one, a name of the model. So we're going to say cat. The cat is the name of the model. Okay, and that's going to determine what's sort of the name of the collection in the database. And then we have to connect a cat or a schema. Okay, so it's always like the model name and the schema. Okay, and then this then gets saved in a variable. Okay, but again, this is what's going to determine sort of how the database is going to name things. So, and how the database recognizes it. So the database now knows that there's this model called cat while our program is running. Okay, well, now what people will oftentimes do is that typing in Mongoose all the time can get kind of frustrating. So what they'll do is they'll destructure schema and model out of there. So they'll do something like this: const schema model equals mongoose. And now by doing that, I don't have to type this anymore because now these things are in their own variable. Okay, and again, sometimes this is all done in multiple files. Okay, but this cat object is what's important. This cat object is what's going to let me add things and subtract things from the database. Okay, so here we'll just run some commands. So here, I'll just make this little section here is where we're going to run different commands. First thing we'll do is we'll do cat.create. So we're going to create a cat. So all you do is you do cat.create and you pass in an object that matches the schema. So name, sniffles, and age 5. And see, this matches the schema. Has a name and an age property. There are no cats yet, so sniffles should be unique. And we have it, so it's met the thing. Okay, now what happens is that once, there's a couple different ways we can write this. So what happens after it's done being created? Because the creation of data in your database is asynchronous. So we have a few ways we can handle this. Okay, we could handle it using a callback. So then what happens is that after we pass in the object, we can then pass in a callback, meaning a function. And if I remember correctly, the way the function always works is that the first argument is the error, and the second argument is like the data that was created or edited, whatever like the result of the thing is. Okay, so just we'll test that out. So we'll say console.log the error, which there hopefully shouldn't be one. Okay. Why doesn't it not like that? Oh, I see what I did. There should be a comma. And there should be a colon in here. There we go. And then console.log the data. The data. Okay. So theoretically, what should happen is that, again, this is going to connect to the database, set up all the events, create our cat model, and now we can use our cat model to create a cat. Okay, so we're going to do that. And then I hit no db.js, and we got an error. So let's see what the error says. Deprecation warning, Mongo error, topology is closed, please connect. Okay, so here what it's complaining at is that it's running, since it's asynchronous, basically what happens is that before this is able to complete, I'm getting disconnected. So in this case, what I'm going to do is I am going to move this connection code, into here, so that way it doesn't connect until after that query is complete. Okay. So that's what that means. Like deprecation, well, this is the error. So see, it says error, because so our error ran. So we got the console log here of error, Mongo error, because it's an error on the Mongo server. The topology is closed, which means, hey, you're trying to do something after the connection's closed. Because again, when anything is asynchronous, it's going to allow everything else to kind of run, the rest of my code to run once before it comes back and completes my asynchronous task, because of the whole like JavaScript event loop. So let's try this again. And see the data is undefined because it did not successfully generate the data. Okay, in this case we were successful. So you can see here, no error, but we got back the data. And, you know, then I could send, so basically this is what I would do in like my API route, and then I could send back that data. Now, I don't know about you, but I'm not the hugest fan of callbacks. This is a fine way of doing things. Okay, but another way we could do things is we could use promises. Okay, so what I would do is just do it like that, and then I would use a .then. Okay, and then the .then would receive the same details, or actually it would just receive the data. Okay, and then I can just console.log the data. And then I could also do a .catch to catch an error. So error console.log error. Okay, so I could do it this way. This is totally a fine way to do it too. So if I do it this way, but let's give it something, well, like I should, well, I'll let the error happen. Okay, so I'm going to get an error. Okay, so let's find out what the error is. So if we take a look at our log here. Okay, see right here, name one dupe key. So when I read the error, I see that, hey, the problem is I specified in my schema that this has to be unique. And I already made a cat named Sniffles. So now if I change this to Sniffles 2, let's see what happens. And see, notice the connection is still open. Okay, so see how like the terminal, because I took out the disconnection line. So to kill the server, to kill that connection, I'm going to do Control C. And then that kills the connection. So now I'll run the file again. And see, once again, I created Sniffles 2. And see, you notice I never specified like this ID field. That's going to always be there. Every Mongo object gets its own sort of unique ID. Okay. So now I'll close that up. Neat. Okay, so now that that is done, what happens if we want to see all the cats? And then in this case, we'll show you the third way. Because the thing about like .thens, it's like it's still not too far off from writing like callbacks. So if you really just kind of want to get out of the whole callback pattern, you can use async await. But again, for async await, you have to write a function. So we'll just call this we'll make a function called query. So we can just store whatever query we're trying to do in there. Equals, that's just a function. Okay. So now what I can do is I can say something like this, like const. First, what I'll do is I'll wrap it in a try catch block, because basically when it comes to async await, you can't really catch errors. There actually is a way. So let's do that. I'll show you like the little secret. What you can do is you can say const data. Okay, because again, the data from the request. Except now we're going to do cat.find and pass in an empty object. So what that's going to do is it just means find all the cats. Find all the cats. And if there is an error, then run this function. So error console log error. So the .catch will still run if there's an error, but I'm going to use the await keyword, which means if this is a successful promise, it'll save the data in here. Okay, so that way I don't have to write like the .then, then the .catch. I can just kind of do it nice like this on one line. Okay, and then I can console.log the data after that, and then I can close the connection. Mongoose .connection, or I can mongoose .disconnect. Okay, and then all I have to do is call the function query. Okay, cool. So now if I run this, await is only valid. Oh, I forgot something. You have to use a single await, you do have to make sure that it knows that the function is an async function by putting the async keyword right there. So there we go. That should fix it. And see, at least like the errors are descriptive. So we always like descriptive errors. Okay, and see, look, now we found like, see, look, there we have sniffles and we have sniffles too. So we got back an array of all our cats. And we can loop through that array and work with that array and do all that fun stuff. Okay, so that's all fun and good. Now let's get a little bit more interesting and start talking about like how would you do like relationships of data. Like Mongo isn't really like the most conducive to like data relationships. It's a document database. It's really meant for like storing a lot of data in really compact spaces. It's not built to be super relational like a relational database, but relational databases also can be slower and eat up more space and be harder to scale. So it just depends on what your needs are. Sometimes, you know, a mixture of both is what's the answer. Okay, but we can create, like, we can do some relationships. Mongoose has some features that kind of creates like this relationship layer that it can handle through the ODM. So let's say we wanted to create like people, cat schema. Like there's two ways you can kind of do relationship. Well, it's three ways. Okay, const, let's say we were to create a person schema equals, and then a person is new schema. Okay, name string, age, a number. Okay, what I'm going to do is I'm going to move this schema before cat. So one way you could do it is you could do an embedded schema. So that's me. What I would do then is I would just say, hey, like every cat has an owner, and that owner is actually what I would do is, yeah, you can say is of type person schema. Okay. And basically what would happen is that basically when I get to that property, I have to put an object that matches the schema. And that object would end up getting its own ID, but it exists within the cat. It doesn't get put in its own like table or collection. It's going to be inside the cat collection, nested inside of the cats. I find this to be kind of harder to work with. Like thought-wise, it's like it's easier to think through, but harder to work with when you actually start like actually working and manipulating the data. Then another way, but it requires again a little bit more manual work on your part, is I could just do it myself in the sense that like I'll just sit there and say there's an owner and it's a string, and what I do is I just track the ID of the person myself. I'm just going to put the string that's the ID number of that person here, and then I'm going to just put it on myself to like take that string and go get that person's data and coalesce the data and do all that fun stuff. I find that particularly an easier route to go, especially if you're talking about like authentication type stuff where like you have a user and you need to track like, hey, which photos are this user. I'll just take the ID as a string and just say, okay, everything has a user field, and I just put the string ID of that user, and I can just query it and say, hey, give me all the stuff that belongs to a user with this ID, and then that works for me. But they do have a built-in way to kind of do that automatically. So the way that would work is we would have to go like this, and we would first declare that the type of this would be, and we actually have to create the other model too. Okay, so we'll create another model, const person equals model person. And this would be the person schema. Okay, so it'd be type, and then the type would be Mongoose dot types, I think. Yep, types dot object ID. So essentially what this type means is that you're going to associate it with the ID of another object in some other collection, some other model. Okay, and then here, I think here we're supposed to specify the model. I might have to go look this up in a second. But then you would just say, hey, the model's person. And this would have to match this. Okay, this would have to match whatever you put here. Because it's going to go look for that model and then say, hey, the ID that you specified here has to match something in that table. But let me just double check that the key is model. So let's go to the Mongoose documentation. Object ID relationships. I want to look for the Mongoose. Here we go. Here we go. So basically, it's ref. Yeah, I thought it wasn't model. So because basically it's referring to that type. Okay, so let's go fix that. So this would be ref. So basically what you're saying is like the owner is going to be a person and whatnot. Okay, so yay. So let's go back to our query. And now that we have a person model, let's create a person. So we'll say const Bob equals a person dot create, because we have the person model now to create persons. Person dot create. And again, I got to use a wait because we're using a wait syntax now. Person dot create. Name Bob. Age 55. And then we're going to take Bob and make him the owner of the two cats. Okay, so we're going to just update the cats. I'm going to just do a wait cat dot I think it's just update many because I want to update a lot of cats. And I'm going to just update all cats. So the first thing is like how am I going to filter them, and since I don't want to filter any of the cats, I want to update all the cats. That's there. Okay, and then I'm going to say, okay, the second object is going to be how I'm going to update. So for all the cats, all I want to do is I want to say that their owner property will now equal Bob. Okay, Bob is their new owner. Okay, because I got Bob stored in this variable, and when you assign the object to an object ID field, it knows just to pull the ID. It just knows. Okay. But I just want to make sure that this worked out, so I will save the result. What does it not like? Okay, and let's just console log these results. Console.log Bob. Make sure that Bob was created, and then we'll console.log result to just see what the result of the update was before we disconnect. Okay, so that's what we're doing there. So now I hit nodedb.js. Okay, and we can see here that Bob was created. Okay, and hey, look, we did modify two cats. Okay, so I'm assuming that that all worked out. So let's see how we can take advantage of that relationship. Because I put Bob in the owner field, and that means their ID is there. So first, let's do it two ways. Let's print out all the cats. So we're gonna do, const cats equals cat dot find. First, we'll just do a straight up find of them, and then console log the cats. So you can kind of see what the raw data looks like. Okay, and when I see like the cats, I forgot to do the await keyword, so I printed out the query object. Let's try that again. Okay, there we go. So we got the two cats, but see the owner is just the ID number. Okay, that's not super fun. I want the actual details of like who the owner is. Well, that's the beauty of actually doing this object ID reference type. Because now what I can do is I can chain this populate function. And then in this populate function, I'm going to specify which field I want to populate. So I'm going to say, hey, populate the owner field. So it's going to go look at the owner field on the schema and see, oh, this is an object ID field that refers to person. So it's going to go look in the person model for all the things where the IDs match and then add those in. So now look at the data after I do this, if I did it successfully. And see now, instead of just the ID, it's going to have the owner there. Okay, so that makes it where you can like have your data separated into multiple models, but easily like just pull the data from the related models by using that populate function. Okay. And this is pretty good. Like this kind of covers like a lot of the low hanging fruit of working with Mongoose. There are functions for finding. There are options like, for example, let's say I only wanted to find one particular cat. I could sit there and say, they're both of age 5. I think both cats. Yeah, they're both age 5. But if I could filter it and say, hey, give me only the cats whose age is, and then you can put an object that says like greater. GT stands for greater than, and it's greater than 3. Okay, so what this means, so there's a whole way of querying. So I could have just done 5, and it'll just give me the ones that are 5. But by putting this object and using this key, $, and you'll see there's a bunch of those, like $GTE for greater than equal than, LT for less than, LTE for less than or equal than, and then I'm going to say, okay, so I want all the cats whose age is greater than 3. That's kind of how that reads. So I should still get both cats. Yep, and I get both cats. But let's say I say it has to be greater than 6. Well, both cats are 5, so I shouldn't get either cat. So let's see what happens. And see, I get an empty array. Okay, so that filter does work. So you can generally use this first object, and again, this is you can use this for like the update function, for the delete function, the create. Well, the create you're just creating, and then you can actually pass an array in the create function to create many of a thing. So there's a lot you can do here. And but yeah, so hopefully this gives you a good idea of how to use Mongoose to communicate with your Mongo database. How would you use this in your application? I mean, I'm assuming that you're building like a backend API. You would probably have one file where you connect to your database and you create your, and then that you would export the connection. Then in another file, you would create your schemas and create your models. And then you would just bring your models into your routes. So that way in your model controller functions, you can then like make any changes to the database you want, either using the callback syntax, using the .then syntax, or using the async await syntax, whichever you're more comfortable with. But yeah, that's how you would do that. Okay, that's how Mongoose works. And again, it doesn't always have to be in your backend server. You can create one-off scripts like I did here. But hopefully this gives you a better idea of how to work with Mongoose and connect to a Mongo database. My name is Alex Merced from alexmercedcoder.com. Have a great day and enjoy.